Crop circles appear in more than 50 countries, and there literally have been thousands of them. Maybe over 10,000 crop circles that we're aware of in the modern era. 12,000 crop circles, 50 years, 30 countries. Every one of them photographed from the air, argued over, and then filed away one at a time. And in half a century, nobody had ever lined them all up in date order and looked at the sequence. Crop circles are basically features, designs, illustrations of high complexity in crops. So a pattern recognition system did no beliefs, no folklore, no idea what a crop circle even was. Just 12,000 shapes and the dates they appeared. It was asked one narrow question, and the answer it returned was not a picture and not an opinion. It was a line on a graph, and that line points at a year. The field where the compasses spin. Wiltshire is a chalk county in southern England, 80 m west of London, and one of the most heavily marked landscapes on the planet. Stonehenge sits on Salisbury Plain. Avebury holds the largest stone circle in Europe. Silbury Hill is a man-made mound of chalk 130 feet high, raised around 2400 BC by people who left no writing to explain why. Stones themselves massive. They're 13 foot tall and some weigh up to 25 tons. Humans have been pressing enormous geometric statements into this earth for 5,000 years. That is where the modern formations concentrate. Overwhelmingly, in that corridor of chalk downland within walking distance of monuments older than the pyramids, the people who walk into them come out saying strange things. Compasses that will not settle. Camera batteries drained inside minutes. Phone screens that flicker and die and then work perfectly again in the car park at the bottom of the hill. Headaches that arrive on the way in and lift on the way out. A metallic taste. A prickling across the forearms. The way the air feels standing too near a transformer. For decades, those accounts were filed under suggestion. And there's a decent case for that filing. People who drive 2 hours to stand inside a mystery are primed to feel one. But the reports did not stop, and the shapes did not stop either. For roughly 50 years, precise geometric formations have appeared overnight in standing crops across at least 30 countries between midnight and first light without witnesses. By breakfast, they are simply present, enormous, and finished. Britain called it a joke early and never revisited the verdict. 2 men with a wooden plank. The headline wrote itself, and the country turned the page. Subscribe now, because the machine that finally read all 50 years at once did not return a verdict on who made them. It returned something narrower and far harder to argue with. And it ends on a date that falls inside the next 5 summers. The machine that was told nothing. The instrument matters more than the answer. So, it is worth walking through what happened to those photographs. The raw material was a mess. 50 years of images shot from light aircraft, microlights, and laterally drones by hundreds of photographers at hundreds of altitudes. Faded 1970s prints scanned on a home flatbed. Frame shot with the aircraft banking hard. The formation skewed across one corner. None of that is usable as it stands. A formation photographed from 200 foot looks more intricate than the same formation from 600. And a machine counting detail would score the first higher for no reason except the pilot's altimeter. So the first job was flattening. Every image was corrected for perspective. The oblique angle mathematically pushed back until the design lay to the lens, as though the camera had hung directly overhead on a wire. Then everything was normalized to a common scale, using whatever was in frame with a known size. The width of a tram line, the spacing left by a combine harvester's wheels, the length of a farm gate. A design measured in pixels means nothing. A design measured in meters can be compared with one photographed in Alberta in 1996. The second job was separating shape from field. Standing wheat is a forest of vertical stems and reeds as textured and noisy. Crop pressed flat is a smooth, swirled surface that catches light along the lay of the stalks. The system was trained to cut along that difference, reducing every photograph to a two-tone mask. Flattened crop white, standing crop black. No color, no crop type, no weather, just the geometry stripped naked. Then the scoring. Each mask was reduced to numbers. How many discrete elements does the design contain, counting every circle, ring, path, arc, and box as one. These energy lines have intersection points, and on these intersection points are things like Stonehenge. How deep does the nesting run? How many axes of symmetry does it hold? And does that symmetry survive across the whole formation or drift outward? Those figures were folded into a single complexity score, which is a crude number. But a crude number applied identically to 12,000 images is worth more than 50 years of people saying that one looks harder than the other. Alongside every image, set a row of metadata, coordinates, country, date of discovery, crop type, weather either side, and a tag noting whether the formation had ever been claimed by a human maker. And the system was told nothing. Not that crop circles were mysterious, not that they might be extraterrestrial, not one word about aliens or folklore. As far as the software knew, it was processing two-tone shapes with dates attached. That is the entire value of the thing. A machine that believes in nothing cannot be accused of wanting the mystery to be real. It has no hope, no dread, no reputation riding on the answer. It measures and reports the measurement. Two boring outcomes were available, and either would have closed the file quietly. Random noise, which is what decades of uncoordinated pranksters ought to produce, or lazy repetition. The archive returned neither. And to see why that matters, the sequence has to be read from its first line, the least impressive shape in the threshold 1990 is where the line on the graph loses its composure. Up to that point, the curve had been patient increments. A little more symmetry each season. One more ring, a steadier hand. An apprenticeship is easy to imagine whoever the apprentice was. The year the decade turned, the line did not step. It jumped. On July 12, 1990, in a barley field below the Alton Barns White Horse, a formation appeared that ran roughly 600 feet from end to end. Not a circle with decorations, a composition, circles, rings, rectangular boxes, straight corridors, and forked appendages that the press started calling a pictogram because it looked like writing. The perfectly symmetrical design is a phenomenon known as a crop circle, and it is just one of many strange patterns. Weeks earlier, a similar structure had appeared at Chelam Down. Weeks later, another at Stanton, St. Bernard. The word entered the vocabulary in a single summer because the shapes had stopped resembling circles at all. Then in July 1991, at the foot of Barbary Castle came a triangle roughly 180 feet on a side with three enormous circular features at its corners, each internally different from the other two, a ratchet spiral in one, concentric rings in another. It required a plan drawn beforehand to scale, then executed at night in a field with no reference points at a size, where 1 degree of drift would have wrecked it beyond disguise. Everything before that clustered in one band, 3 elements, 4, sometimes 5, within reach of a determined team with boards, rope, and one long summer night. What began appearing from 1990 onward sat far above it. 15 distinct elements. 20 nested shapes locked inside other shapes, each holding a precise angular relationship to the last. Symmetry maintained across a whole field with no measurable drift. And the strangeness was not only the size of the jump. A gradual advance should look like a curve with transitional seasons bridging the old band and the new. The record contains no bridge. The transition is close to vertical. One season the fields were producing short, simple sentences. The next paragraphs of interlocking geometry as though the intermediate grammar had never been necessary and the leap was not local. That is the reason the file did not close there. If one brilliant operator in Wiltshire had perfected a technique that sophistication should have surfaced in one place first and spread outward like a fashion, appearing months or years later in the Netherlands, in Canada, in the wheat of New South Wales, unevenly from a source at the speed of people telling other people. The threshold was crossed in multiple countries inside the same narrow window, in fields separated by oceans and languages, and every barrier that slows a shared trick down. And having leapt, the fields did not settle. The curve went from a hill to a wall, and then kept steepening past the wall, which forces the ugliest question in the file. Did something change in 1990? Not in the fields, in whatever was making them. because a hand does not learn overnight to draw 20 perfect nested elements across an acre of standing wheat in a single darkness. A skill like that is built and failed at in view of anyone paying attention. The record contains almost no failures. No botched 12-element design left to rot in a field unless the failures were never left in the fields at all because the men making them had spent 15 years getting good in private. And in September 1991, two of them walked into a newspaper office and said exactly that. The men with the plank, they were called Doug Bauer and Dave Klee, and they were in their 60s. Bauer was a picture framer in Southampton who had spent years in Australia in the 1960s where he heard the story of a saucer nest found in a Queensland reedbed. Klee was a landscape painter. They drank on Friday nights at a pub near Cheesefoot Head. And on one of those evenings in 1976, according to the account they gave a newspaper Today in September 1991, Bauer looked out at the valley and said, "In effect, let's give them something to think about." Their kit was almost insultingly simple. A 4-foot plank with a loop of rope at each end stepped on to press the crop down while walking a spiral. String and a stake to hold the radius. Later, a baseball cap with a loop of wire on the peak sighted through like a gun sight to keep a long line true in the dark. Picture that properly because it is the most human passage in this entire story. Two middle-aged Englishmen, well past their physical prime, climbing over a gate at 1 o'clock in the morning with a plank under one arm. Wet knees, midgets, crop dust in the throat, the smell of barley at night, which is sweeter than people expect. The terror of headlights swinging across the hedging. A drop stake hunted for on hands and knees with no torch, because a torch in a field at 2 in the morning is a confession visible from a mile away. Cold tea from a flask at 3. Standing in the middle of something neither of them could see. Working blind. Sighting through a bent wire on a hat. Trusting the geometry to be there at sunrise. Then the drive home with the plank in the boot and the weight and a newspaper printing your Friday night across a full page under the words, "No scientist can explain." They demonstrated it for reporters, making a formation and inviting an expert to authenticate it, which he did on camera. They claimed more than 200 formations over 15 years. For most of the public that closed it, this explains a great deal of the archive. It covers the Wiltshire concentration because that is where Bauer and Klee lived and drank. It covers the aerial composition because a hoax nobody photographs from the air is a hoax nobody hears about. It covers 1990 because by then they had been practicing for 14 years, and by then they were not alone. That last point does the heaviest lifting. Once the phenomenon was famous, it attracted rivals. Circle Makers, the collective founded by John Lundberg, has produced commission formations for advertising and television for 3 decades and does not hide it. In 2002, a team assembled by the Discovery Channel and led by researchers from MIT built a complex formation overnight and had it pass casual inspection. Garden rollers replaced planks. GPS replaced string and wire. So the counter case is genuinely strong, and anyone who skips past it is selling something. What it does not cleanly cover is the timing of the international jump or the near total absence of failed attempts in the record. The plant work is where this stops being about art and starts being about physics, and where the argument gets difficult in both directions. The central figure is W.C. Levengood, a biophysicist based in Michigan who had spent his career on plant physiology and seed research. From the early 1990s, he examined samples taken from formations in England and the United States, working alongside Nancy Talbot and John Burke through the BLT research team. His findings were published in 1994 in the journal Physiologia Plantarum, and again in 1999 in the Journal of Scientific Exploration. The work itself is unglamorous in the extreme. A man in a field with paper envelopes and a marker pen cutting stems at the base. Then walking beyond the edge into untouched crop and cutting controls from the same rows, the same soil, the same everything except the thing in question. Then weeks of measuring swollen joints on dried stalks with calipers. 3 claims came out of it. The first concerns the growth nodes, the small swollen joints along a cereal stem. Levengood reported that in samples from inside formations, These nodes were significantly elongated compared with controls taken outside. The stems were bent, not broken, and in many cases, the crop kept growing and ripening while lying flat, curving toward the light like grass under a fallen branch. The second concerns holes. Levingood reported expulsion cavities blown outward through the node walls. The pattern expected if moisture inside the stem had been flash heated into steam in a fraction of a second. Not a stem crushed from outside. A stem opened from within. The third concerns the soil. In some sampled formations, tiny iron-rich magnetic particles were found in the surface layer at concentrations well above the surrounding field, with a crystalline structure consistent with material melted and rapidly cooled. Meteoric dust is the ordinary explanation for microspheres in topsoil. Meteoric dust does not usually fall in a pattern with an edge you can stand on. Levingood's proposed mechanism was plasma vortices, spinning columns of ionized air delivering brief bursts of microwave-range energy that heated the water in the stems from within. And now the honest half of the file. This work has been attacked hard, and not always unfairly. Node elongation happens naturally in any flattened crop because a stem knocked over by wind or rain reorients itself toward the light, and the lower nodes stretch to do it. A process called gravitropism. Critics, including Joe Nickell and Francesco Grassi, have argued that the effects are consistent with plants that have simply been lying down for several days, and that sampling from known hoax formations has sometimes produced comparable readings. The publication record is thin, the replication record thinner, and BLT research is not an independent university department. So the physical evidence is contested. It is not nothing. It is not proof. And it sits in the uncomfortable middle where most interesting things live. But it does establish something measurable in these fields beyond the picture. And it sets up the summer when the shapes stop being pictures at all. The binary summer. By the mid-1990s, the geometry had acquired quality much harder to dismiss than beauty. It had acquired mathematics. The first to say so with any authority was Gerald Hawkins. And Hawkins was not a fringe figure. He was a Boston University astronomer, the man who in 1963 published the analysis in Nature, arguing that Stonehenge functioned as an astronomical instrument. In the 1990s, he turned the same attention to crop formations and reported that the ratios between the areas of their component circles repeatedly matched the diatonic ratios of the musical scale. He also identified 4 geometric theorems embedded in the designs, then derived a fifth containing the other 4. That fifth, as far as he could determine, appeared nowhere in the Euclidean literature. He published it as a challenge. Within a year, a formation appeared containing a construction that satisfied it. Then came July 7th, 1996, and the field opposite Stonehenge. The formation is known as the Julius Set, a fractal spiral built from around 150 circles of varying diameter laid out in a curling arm roughly 900 feet long. A fractal repeats its own structure at shrinking scales the way a coastline or a fern does. It needs either a computer or an extremely disciplined hand to render accurately. The disputed detail is the timing. A pilot and a gamekeeper reported the field empty in the late afternoon and the formation complete inside an hour in daylight beside one of the busiest tourist roads in England. That account has been challenged, but the design itself is not in dispute, and neither is the one that followed at Milk Hill in August 2001. A 6-armed spiral containing 409 circles across some 800 feet, then the formations did something that changed the category. They started producing data. In August 2001, in a field beside the Chilbolton Radio Telescope in Hampshire, 2 formations appeared in quick succession. One was a human face rendered in pixel-like blocks of standing and flattened crop, an image that dissolves into meaningless stripes on the ground and resolves only from the air. The second was a point-by-point response to the Arecibo message, the radio transmission beamed into space by Frank Drake and Carl Schon in 1974. The original encoded the numbers 1 to 10, the atomic numbers of the elements of life, the formula for DNA, a human figure, and the solar system. The Chilbolt version reproduced that grid with alterations, a different element in the chemistry, a different planetary system. Consider what that requires, not artistry, bookkeeping. Reproducing that grid and crop means laying down more than 1,600 cells in the dark, each either flattened or left standing with no way to step back and check. In August 2002, at Crabwood near Winchester, another face appeared, this one holding a disc. The disc was a spiral of blocks that read outward as a sequence of present and absent elements produces a string of ASY binary, the code used to store text on a computer. It decodes to a legible English message. Nobody is claiming the machine could tell you who typed that message. Both formations are widely regarded as human work and highly skilled human work at that. But the analysis was not scoring authenticity.